Hi, this is Paul. I'm still working through my sound issues. Hopefully, I won't be clipping in this one like I was in the last one. As some of you might have noticed, I've been playing a lot of conversations, partly because I haven't been doing new content, partly because I had a trip out to the East Coast where I spent some time with my family. But also, we did the retreat slash meetup thing in my sister's country inn, and that went very, very well. We had 10 people who gathered, and we did it in about 24 hours. Most of them flew in from different parts of the continent, mostly from the east. Some drove in, and it was a great time. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was prepping for this video is on Rebel Wisdom, you have all this talk about collective cognition. And what I really sense is happening is a lot of collective cognition with the videos and the Discord servers and the meetups and the other channels like the Randos United and Mary's channel and Karen's channel and this little corner of the internet, as John Vervaeke and Sevilla King say. So there's a lot of collective cognition going on. And so really the number of hours that we spent sharing stories, talking about each other, talking about the ideas that we talk about on this channel were very worthwhile. I think everyone there left having a sense that this was a really special time. And how much more powerful was it, instead of sort of talking at each other via YouTube, but to be able to talk with each other in a real space in real time. This is my sister's country inn, and she's doing a decorating channel now. She was doing a fix-up channel for a while, but they can't do a lot of fixing up in the cold weather, so she's doing a decorating channel, and so the place is very well decorated and very comfortable, and we just spent a lot of time there around wood stoves and talking. So it's way beyond any one of us. I don't know. Oh yeah, the collective cognition's way beyond any one of us. And just as I was preparing this video, I saw this new video from the Randos United channel dropped on the Joker, and I took a sneak peek at it, and it just I just had very much the sense that it started up where what I've been thinking about, and as many of you know, I've had one conversation with Sam. I'm going to have another one at some point. I've had a few conversations with Luke and Julian, and I know Luke is itching to have another conversation. But they just picked up this channel really where I left off, and let's look at it a
When he
little
shoots Murray, that's
Oops.
the ascendant of the.
Well, we
We
can
were
introduce
just talking.
ourselves. Do we do that anymore? No.
No, we're all famous, so everybody knows us.
We're all internet famous.
Yes. On the little corner of the internet.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So we were just talking about confessionalism and how do you define the word Christian and what does the word Christian mean? And I was just saying
that is something that I've just been thinking a lot about, and I'm going to play again some Tom Holland from that Delling pod again, and then thinking about Jordan Peterson telling Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty that they act like they're Christians, and of course Dillahunty and Sam Harris getting rather offended. And so I'm going to play some of Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins. I'm going to play some Richard Dawkins on this too, in his conversation with Joe Rogan. This is very much a question. What does it mean to be Christian? And do these propositional boundary markers, are these the best tools to figure out who we are and what we're doing? Again, we're back to identity, and again back to the Charles Taylor's little book on the ethics of authenticity, and the fact that now in this culture where we imagine we self-construct, that we create our own identities. And so then the question of, well, what exactly is a Christian? I noticed these guys jumped right into this on this conversation.
one saying of Jesus I've started to think about recently is the whole thing about don't judge unless you be judged. And I think part of what he's getting at there is it's you can't really draw these hard and fast lines and say you're in, you're out. You can't really say, the spirit is moving. You can't. I think it's about you can't. The spirit moves through people in strange ways, and our trying to put people into orthodoxy boxes is just one way of stopping that process and saying, okay, you need to be all the way here or you're not in. You need to accept these things or you're not in. And we sort of need to accept the fact that things are a lot more complicated than that, and the lines are fuzzy.
Now, bear in mind that this is Julian talking, and Julian is a Hutterite, so he's very much lived his life with intentional community, intentional Christian community, propositional frameworks dominating the structures. Now, again, Vervaeke's 4 Ps: propositional, perspectival, participatory, and participatory, propositional. I forgot one of the P's. It'll bubble up. But so we've been working on these things all along, and so thinking, well, if Tom Holland comes along and notes, I think in a devastating critique of the new atheists, that our society is deeply Christian, and the only reason we can't see that is because, kind of like a Foster Wallace, what is water? What is water? We don't know. We're so swimming in Christianity, but of course, being in the church business, my goal is to try and make people to be better Christians. But what does that mean? Where do these lines lie? And now Sam's going to jump in, which is truly ironic because Sam is one of our heretics. He's not an atheist, or what is a heretic? Well, Sam actually has a confessional heresy in that he's a biblical Unitarian. So that's going to come up here.
That's
Yeah.
okay.
As a weird person to be defending lines and boxes, I think one purpose of them, though, is that religious communities help foster trust and help facilitate interaction because there's a shared bundle of rules and performances and all of those sorts of things. And if you share that with a bunch of people, then you can assume that they share it and you can act accordingly, right?
Right. This propositional way of knowing is vitally important, and the propositional is given via the technology of writing and confession and subscription. It in fact gives form and shape to community so that communities can extend horizontally, so that communities can travel through time. I've often made the point that part of the function of the Bible in Christianity is that it actually helps us transcend through time. And again, if you go back to Tom Holland's Delling Pod conversation, Christianity both has a progressive idea of revelation, has a progressive notion that, in fact, we are moving towards an eschaton. Now, that progressivism within Christianity obviously has a secular component in progressive society. It was mirrored by Marx. Many other philosophies mirrored it. But again, this just shows the deep, deep influence of Christianity, of Jesus, of the Apostle Paul, of the New Testament informing the Western world, informing the Christian world, that we have these overtly confessional, propositional Christian elements, and alongside we have these secular analogs that are continuing to develop, and actually they're usually feeding each other and going back and forth over the line. So you have people who might not go to church and might not identify as Christian and might not participate, but in fact there's communication going back and forth with these things.
So it enables the community to have higher levels of trust and cooperation than it could without them. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of...
So Sam is making the point that, well, if you and I both match up and agree in terms of our propositional way of knowing and match the words up, this encourages us to trust within the community and allows communities to form. And this is very much something that comes at the heels of the Protestant Reformation, because you have this confessional movement where now Luther sort of breaks the thing open, and now all these, they don't have labels for any of this stuff early on, of course, and Luther and Calvin all imagine, okay, we're reforming Catholicism, that's our goal, but the reform doesn't go viral enough and it doesn't take. So then you have this confessional movement in the Protestant churches where confessions are are coming up, and the community is saying, this is who we are. And so in the Christian Reformed Church, as a Christian Reformed minister, it's a confessional church, and so we have these confessions back and forth that we subscribe to,
and it needs,
of which the Trinity is part of it,
quick and dirty ways to know, wait a minute, am I acting like you like you're an outsider, or am I acting with you like you're an insider?
And it was so interesting that when Sam came on the channel the first time, it was the Christians that jumped him. And this is a dynamic that later Dawkins and Rogan will pick up on, because it's always the narcissism of small differences. But are they small? It's those who betray the community that we get most angry with. So Sam comes on the channel with his what he calls his biblical Unitarianism, and it's a lot of the Christians who jump on him, whereas atheists come on the channel and the Christians just leave them alone, and it's very, very interesting dynamics.
And those sort of confessional boxes can serve that purpose to a degree, and that does accomplish something.
I think
I would push back on that, though.
And of course Luke is going to push back on this.
I would say that those confessional boxes they function completely different than the trust that you have in a family. I don't.
Yes and no, because it's the propositional things that you do at the marriage altar that actually create the family. And if someone breaks some of those propositional things, someone what these propositional words in a family, such as "I don't love you anymore," or "I'm going to divorce you," or "I'm not going to listen to you anymore," or "I hate you." These propositional identity statements are very powerful. But Luke has an important point here too, and that's where all of this is really quite complex.
I don't interact with my kids or my wife at all that way, and I would say that's the predominant metaphor of the New Testament, besides the body, the family of God. And I actually think parents that function with their kids that way around confessional structures, and if you're in and you're out, I actually think those are the families that are highly dysfunctional and end up getting destroyed. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's any different.
Yeah.
I understand that it's a quick shorthand, but I guess I would propose that that's the whole problem with what I always try to talk about of the egoic intellect in the West.
Sure.
Can I jump in with a few things?
Yeah.
Well, you were just saying you want to use the model of family instead of body, but this is something a friend of mine pointed out recently, is the body is an organism, right? And various parts of the body are healthy, various parts of the body are unhealthy. And so just this metaphor of a body is just a way of thinking of this church as this living, organic, developing thing. And it's not something that can be just sort of put in a box. It's filled with people, right? And with regards to what Sam just said, I think I would sort of defend my approach by saying you sort of have to have two stances. I think I see a value in, the church community, which does have its boundaries and does have, this is what we believe, and this is what we hold each other accountable to. But I think this formational community then also has to have this attitude of being open to the Spirit and not judging people from other communities. So there's sort of this formation.
And what Julian is laying out here is basically confessionalism
within this community, but then this being open to what's outside, which should lead to this healthy dynamic of interaction with other communities, while also sort of this openness to other communities, while also reinforcing your own community and what you stand for.
And now what's interesting is that confessionalism here is very much a product of, our identity, and our being isn't simply inherited or received, but it's achieved. And now as communities, we're going to create it via these confessions, and we're going to subscribe to these things. But that creates very much an inside-outside. And so already, in a sense, we're the space of the secular is implicit in the confessional move. and of course this is something that the Protestant Reformation just sort of blows open, and you might think that in the Protestant Reformation it's this giant explosion where somehow they're beginning to engage the dynamics of the idea of the secular. That I'm going to play the Tom Holland video in a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, okay, two things. First, are we going to talk about Joker, or are we going to talk about this?
I want to talk about Joker.
Okay, and then secondly, because we're still on this topic and we get going and I get 1,000 thoughts. So, we'll
keep going, but I haven't even watched the whole video, but it's I'm excited about it. So this question, who is a Christian? And we have this dynamic interplay between the secular sphere and then the confessional sphere, where we have community identity. And that community identity, one of the things that we have to consider when we talk about this community identity, that's the reason that there's so much propositional stuff going on, is that those are, in a sense, the only tools we've got. I'm going to identify and I'm going to use a word. Those are the best tools, because words are these amazing things that they don't corrode when we speak them. They might get a bit threadbare when we don't use them properly, but so the propositional, confessional way of knowing is vital in a certain dynamic interchange with the secular, and go back and forth. But there's the participatory and the perspectival, and we're all in the middle of this as we go, and this is where Jordan Peterson comes along and says to Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty, but you act as if you believe in God, and of course they're terribly at that. And now notice he's challenging them. They're saying, no, the propositional is dominating, and Peterson's saying, yeah, but you have to understand the propositional within the context of the other three P's. And that's how you have to work it together. So you can't just play games with the propositional and not understand the performative, and that's not actually one of the P's, but the perspectival and the participatory. You have to see those all within the context. Now, Tom Holland and Rene Girard have been noting the deep moral assumptions inherited from Christianity, and Rene Girard, I've played that clip from his CBC interviews quite a few times, and then more recently Tom Holland's, where they keep using Christianity against Christianity, and if you listen to Richard Dawkins and his conversation with Joe Rogan, they keep talking about these immoral, the immorality of Christianity, and this is the charge that Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris, they keep bringing up too, and it's like, well, where do you get your morality from? Oh, we get our morality from reason, and it's like, and that's exactly where Peterson keeps challenging them. No, you don't. And the value of Peterson's biblical lectures has been understanding that the machinery that we use to construct this other layer, this is where we get the scientific vision and the scientific image and the manifest image. I didn't decide to play that clip, but it certainly does belong here in terms of these two images. So now let's jump into Tom Holland a little bit on this. And I've played some of this before.
And one of the difficulties with recognizing that is, again, precisely the degree to which the Christian notion of there being something called a religion has become universal.
Okay, that's the Christian notion. Again, these are all the assumptions that are so deep within us, we fail to recognize them as Christian. And again, this argument by Tom Holland is just simply devastating, and that it comes from a historian of which neither Joe Rogan nor Richard Dawkins are. In fact, they don't know anywhere near enough history. This is just a devastating argument against the celebrity atheists.
Wherever European languages are spoken, and often beyond that as well, the concept that there is something called a religion exists, and people tend to assume that this is, you might as well say, there are trees or there are dogs as their religions. It seems to be as natural as that. But it isn't.
And again, that's exactly how they speak. But how do you know it's as natural? How do you know it isn't that just the way it is? It's because in history, it hasn't been this way. In other words, that which is obvious to us has not been obvious to others, which says, well, maybe it's not simply a function of this naive realism that the celebrity atheists like to promote, that, well, we're just these creatures walking around and we're not deeply embedded in a way of seeing the world. Even if you go back to Brett Weinstein's comments with Alistair McGrath, that, the story world in which we live is a human being born away from human beings is, in a sense, not human, because all of this stuff that we bring up with us. Again, this is Jordan Peterson's big project that he tried to engage Sam Harris with, but in the conversations he had with him, but Sam Harris simply continues to assert the naive realism.
The concept of religion, again, is a highly culturally distinctive notion that is bred of the marrow of Christian assumptions. And essentially it relates to what you were talking about the concept of the secular, which again is a wholly contingent, culturally specific idea, which no other civilization has
There's
really...
no concept of the secular in Islam.
No, and there wasn't a concept of the secular in Christianity, really, until the kind of early Middle Ages, really.
So and Abelard and the people like that.
Yes, around that period. And it goes back to the time of Augustine, who is living when Rome in 410 is sacked, and there are lots of Romans who haven't become Christian who say, well, this is because we've abandoned the old ways, we've abandoned the old gods, so we're being punished. And Augustine says, no, not at all. The divine cannot be manifest in the earthly order. Only the radiant purity of heaven is eternal. Everything human, everything mortal, everything terrestrial is in a state of flux. And he reaches for a Latin word, saeculum.
Now, it's really helpful to understand C.S. Lewis's discarded image and how that rolls into this, because to understand just the way this image that the got classical into the Middle Ages of the unmoved mover and the spheres on down, and then here the earth at the center, we often think, well, the earth is the foundation. No, the earth was this terribly dysfunctional place where there's decay, unlike the space up above the moon. Okay, and I've been listening to Planet Narnia, which is now an audiobook, and really enjoying that, because I think his name is Michael Ward. He lays this stuff out really well as he's talking about why C.S. Lewis constructed the Chronicles of Narnia as he did.
To define that, and saeculum literally means the limit of the span of human memory. So 80 years, 100 years, 120 years, it comes to be identified with 100. So hence saeculum feeds into, siècle, French word for century, and so on. And so the saeculum, the dimension of the saeculum, the city of man, gets counterpointed to the city of God.
Right.
And if you want to, as a human who is trapped within the saeculum, the flux of things, if you want to get close to God before death, then you need to bind yourself to him.
Okay, and this is where I've spoken before, Charles Taylor's one speed, two speed. So this is where before the Reformation you have the religious people, okay? And the religious people are the monks and the priests, and these are people who are, in a sense, spatially working their way up to God by binding themselves to God by these practices, devotion to the poor, devotion to study, all of this stuff. And then the other speed of people are farming and doing this. And of course, this gets disrupted in the Protestant Reformation. Luther has the priesthood of all believers. John Calvin, very much part of my tradition, where, being a pastor is no more spiritual than being a farmer. And, even 500 years after the Protestant Reformation, I find in the Christian Reformed Church, this idea doesn't take. People don't really believe it. No, pastor, you're more spiritual, but all of these things are getting worked through.
And again, in Latin, there is a word religio, which in the classical period meant something that binds you to a god. So it could be a priesthood, it could be a festival, it could be a sacrifice. In the Christian period, religio comes to mean those who, religiones are those who particularly bind themselves to God. So monks, nuns, hermits, people like that.
So then you have the religious. Well, they're the non-religious. Well, what do we call them? Well, we call them the secular. They're the people down here, and then you have this interchange between the two speeds where, well, we offer the priests food and support, and the priests pray for us, and you have the merits and all of that system that gets deconstructed in the Protestant Reformation.
And over the course of the early Middle Ages and then into the high Middle Ages, you get this idea that there's the dimension of religio and there's the dimension of the saeculum. And this becomes institutionalized in the 11th century when kind of radicals, and in fact you could almost say heretics, they seize control of the most prestigious bishopric in Christendom, that of Rome. And out of this kind of papal order, they found Europe's first great revolutionary order, which says that the dimension of the church, of the sacred, of the holy, of religio has to be permanently and fundamentally separated from the dimension of the saeculum. So kings and emperors who until that point had the perfect...
And you could see, in a sense, that this division, it mirrors in some ways the axial age type division, but this division here is going to strain and then, in a sense, break the sacramental, the ancient sacramental assumptions. And so with Luther's Reformation, it very much becomes our relationship to God is psychological, and it's very much of the mind. And so the stuff of whether we eat bread or don't eat bread, whether we eat fish on Friday, and all of this stuff that was very deeply embedded in this sacramental perspective of the world gets broken apart. And you can see the seeds of this are laid here on this division between the religious and the secular.
Right to appoint bishops and themselves had all kinds of sacral power. They get kind of shoved to one side, and basically there's a great project to drain the dimension of the saeculum of things that had made it sacred. And the effect of that is to kind of institutionalize this idea that there is a division between the dimension, let's say, of religio and the dimension of the saeculum. And then in the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, everyone has a religio. It's not just monks anymore. Everyone has a religio. And so...
And you can see, in a sense, the deconstruction of the sacraments. And, well, then we have the two-speed. Well, in the Protestant Reformation, then you go to the one-speed. And John Calvin, in a sense, wants to have a holy city. And this, of course, will go all the way to the Pilgrims and the establishment of the Plymouth Bay colony. And so this idea is very important and very much still with us.
You start to get a new sense of what becomes anglicized to become religion. So religion has two shades of meaning. On the one hand, it's the personal relationship that you as a believer have with the divine.
Deeply psychological post-Luther, and what we would call spiritual in our terminology.
What do you believe? What do you think? What's your relationship?
And the propositional, well, the propositional is sort of structures that and keeps order there and helps us find each other and know who to trust, I think, as Sam said quite well.
To a God. This is what religion means to a Christian in the 17th, 18th century. And then against that, it's something that can be defined against the secular. So it's something that's kind of to one side. So religion is something that is separate from society, the economy, music, culture.
And this is very much going to be the assumptions of Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins when they're talking here.
So whatever. Yeah. So you have secular music, you have religious music, and everyone starts to know what that means. And so the idea that religion is something that can be parked on one side, by the time that the British start, for instance, to take over India, this is something that they're absolutely taking for granted. And when they go abroad, they get asked, well, what is the religion? What is the religion of people in the Ottoman Empire? Oh, it's something called Islam. what's the religion of people in Hindustan, where the Hindus live, the Indians live? Oh,
And read the book. They called it Mohammedanism.
it must be something called Hinduism. And so Christians construct this idea of there being world religions. But Christianity is, of course, the prototype. So it's like the legend of Procrustean, the one that the thief, the robber that Theseus kills in the legend, who supposedly takes travellers and makes them sleep in his magical bed, and it always fits them. And the way that he makes the bed always fit his visitors is, if they're too short, he racks them, and if they're too long, he chops bits off.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what modern Western society, imperialism, has done with the belief systems and the structures of belief of other civilizations, is that it's imposed this Procrustean model of religion, across the entire world. And so, to that extent, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, these are all concepts that have been Christianized. And there's an Indian scholar who said, I think accurately and brilliantly, that Christianization advances in two ways. It advances through conversion, obviously, but it also proceeds through secularization. In other words, in convincing societies that there is something called the secular and that there is something called religion that is separate from it. And in that sense, although the Raj did not convert India to Christianity on any mass scale, it did convert it to secularism. And when the Raj ended and the British left, India was re-established as a secular republic,
Right.
and to this day it remains a secular republic.
I like that. So,
And not only did this happen in India with Ataturk after the First World War in what was the Ottoman Empire, which was defeated in the First World War, Ataturk creates a secular state in what today we call Turkey. And so you see that this, in fact, goes all over the world and conquers everything. And in fact, this will hitch a ride on the great ideological movements that happen in the 20th century of Nazism and more predominantly of communism. Because this is of course all built into Marx, and so when the communists conquer China and Vietnam and Asia, when it conquers these places, well, secularism just keeps winning, even if confessional Christianity, they wouldn't call themselves Christians, but you can see how this movement is redefining the world at a very deep level in a way that nobody is noticing. In fact, not only is nobody noticing, that Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins are completely unaware of it. And so now they come at it with their naive realism, which, now there's this naive realism. Well, that's our religion. Well, that's the water you're swimming in. And in fact, it's deeply embedded within Christianity. That's in a sense the plan B of Christianity that no one can seem to resist. And so you have the colonial powers attempting, as he made the point, the Raj, overtly confessional evangelism, which doesn't really necessarily work so well, partly because of, I think, I was either going to record this or do some more commentary on Jordan's biblical series, because the way that the biblical series is important is that what Peterson is doing is he's laying out the argument that he very much, that again, I keep saying that our machine code of culture is narrative, and it's those narratives that we live in. It's the participatory and the perspectival knowledge that we're living in. And of course, then the propositional comes in later, and we use that to put words on the walls, but it's deeply embedded in these stories that we're living in. In fact, we're so embedded in them, we don't see them anymore. And of course, this was Peterson's point to Sam Harris, that Sam Harris just simply could not or would refuse to see. So more effective was the suggestion that religion, which is exactly what Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the celebrity atheist will be denouncing, that somehow this is something that you can live without. Well then what exactly are you living within if that's something you live without? But this is in fact the more viral viral idea beneath Christianity that only people outside of it can begin to recognize, that there is no outside of religion. There is no outside of a worldview, because you have to find your way through that cornfield that Peterson notes. I mean, we're going to get to one side or the other. You actually have to figure out how to navigate it. There's nothing that you're not actually participating in. Now, while I should be quickly reading Tom Holland's Dominion, my ADHD mind, I have gotten distracted in another book that I've wanted to read for a long time that I finally started picking up and spent a lot of time with over the last couple of weeks when I wasn't making videos, with Timothy Snyder's Black Earth. His book Bloodlands just really caught my imagination, and you do not read a Timothy Snyder book if you're feeling a little depressed, because his books are rough as he goes through the history of the first half of the 20th century in terms of the Soviets and the Nazis. And in this book, I've learned a ton about what Nazi is, and in a sense that the Tom Holland Dellingpod interview sent me to it, because this had been on my mind, but I hadn't purchased it and I hadn't started it. But when he drew the connection between Nazism and environmentalism, I thought, what's with that? And so the introduction to the book is the chapter before chapter 1, which is basically Hitler's worldview, was just a revelation to me, in that, I had never perceived, Hitler was anti-Semitic. Well, what's behind anti-Semitism? Well, the stuff behind Hitler's anti-Semitism was likely not the stuff behind Luther's anti-Semitism, or the anti-Semitism of many people in Europe. The stuff behind Hitler's anti-Semitism is Darwin and Spencer, and this view of the world, which again sort of came out of the secular view that says, well, all of this higher cognitive theoretical thinking, this is all a distraction from what is most truly real, which is our animal selves. And I immediately began to see the connections between Hitler's way of thinking and, ironically, the way of thinking of the celebrity atheists, in terms of this ardent assertion and naturalism that, well, we're simply animals and we're having this manifest image delusion, but we don't really have free will, and these stories don't really govern us, and it's really just the underlying things, the biology and the biological nature that is really just asserting itself, and everything else is the rider on the elephant. We're just making up stories. And so Nazism is actually, and I very much recommend this book. I'm not done with it yet, but each chapter I read, it's just very high resolution and stark, and just reshaping a lot of my assumptions about what happened at this particular time and this particular part of history, where the Nazis basically say, politics is all part of this second level thinking, and it's got to be done away with. And so whereas the communists came in and everything has to be the state, the Nazis come in and states just have to be destroyed, because we have to get back to what's natural. A Nazi walking through Costco today saying natural and organic would say, yeah, we're winning, but we really have to get ardent applying this natural. And Nietzsche, of course, Nazis very much come after Nietzsche, because Nietzsche said, well, this whole slave morality that Christianity brought on us, this slave morality that the celebrity atheists, in fact, continue to assert and use to critique and condemn Christians and even the Christian Bible, this slave morality is unnatural, and the law of the jungle is natural, and what we have to do is really get back to a natural world. And this is behind the hatred of the Jews, because they look back and say, well, this all got started, and we could probably blame Plato and Socrates and Aristotle too, but it's really the Jews and their books and then what gave birth to Christianity that popularized it. And so if we're going to get rid of the politics and state and all of this theoretical thinking, all this idea of transcendence, and get down to our true animal selves and get rid of this manifest image and this mythology, well, it's the Jews that are to blame for that. So we've got to get rid of that. So not only, send them to Madagascar. Again, I learned stuff in this book that I never had, the complicated history of trying to to get the Jews out of Europe, and the connection with Zionism and the idea that they're going to send them all to Madagascar of all places. And this then becomes a catchword in Nazi. It's just so much more complex than all of the propaganda, the low resolution propaganda that we tend to use to try to imagine that the Nazis are somehow these evil people and we're somehow good people, and if we can just not be racist and like they are racist, then we won't repeat these things. And Snyder just deconstructs all of that and shows how the processes, the historical processes that led to all of these things that don't really seem to fit in. But by destruction of states, the Nazis go and believe that now natural evolution can continue, and humanity within species, against it's a very racialized struggles. Communist Harari mentions this in his book Homo Sapiens. Communists imagine that the story of the world is about class struggle, so it's an economic theory. Well, the Nazis see that the story of the world is about racial struggle, and these different ethnic tribes are different races, and it's the struggle between them. And so what Hitler and the Nazi Party want to do is get rid of all of this theory, and so get rid of the slave morality that Nietzsche calls out, and get to the point where the truly powerful and strong can ascend to the top of the dominance hierarchy and dominate the rest. But what's notable in the book in the last chapter that I was reading was how Christianity in Germany was a real problem for Hitler, and in his first attempted coup, for which he was imprisoned, when he wrote Mein Kampf, he really had to figure out how to lie and deceive the German people and cover what his true intention was. The Poles understood quite a bit of it, but even they, the Poles understood a bit, the Russians understood a bit, but read the book. It's a phenomenal book. So the destruction of the state, the natural evolution of humanity will be allowed to govern the future. Now, Timothy Snyder basically says that this is a warning to us, because we're not. He in a sense, Tom Holland notes that, well, we don't talk about the devil anymore because we have Nazis, and we don't talk about evil anymore because we have Hitler. Or we don't talk about the devil anymore because we have Hitler, and we don't talk about evil anymore because we have the Nazis. And Tom Holland notes that those just kind of slide into our low-resolution perspectival idea of, oh, that's the evil over there. And so if I'm nice to Jews instead of murdering them, well, then somehow I can avoid all of this. But what Snyder's book shows is that this is way deeper, and in fact, the stuff that we're all swimming in is the same stuff that all of Europe was swimming in, and in all of this stuff. So on the plane back from Massachusetts, a number of people had said, oh, you really got to listen to Joe Rogan talk to Richard Dawkins. It's like, well, I don't know if I want to listen to that, but I don't know what prompted me, but I started listening to it, and I don't know how much time I'll have to go through it. Maybe I'll have to go through it more in another video, but started listening to their conversation, and I know Bishop Barron was doing some little snippets of it. But thinking about the Tom Holland and these guys just being totally naive about, well, we don't have a religion. Well, we don't have these propositional ideas. We're free of that. We're just, oh, really? That's all it takes? I'm deeply skeptical.
My deathbed was not as hard as you remember.
I didn't mean hard in a negative sense. I mean, you push. You're so enthusiastic about your atheism.
I'm enthusiastic.
Yes.
I'm also humorous. I mean,
Yes.
I like to think it's a funny book, but a lot of people do think it's hard in the other sense. And sometimes when they read it again, they realize, actually, no, it's more humorous. It's not so edgy, not so hard-hitting as they originally thought it was.
Well, I think that's probably because you've had some interviews in the past where you have talked to some fiercely religious people, and you've had some cantankerous interactions with them. I think maybe so they associate you with having this almost aggressively atheistic stance.
And Rogan here has a real point, because these guys have been absolutely evangelical in the promotion of their ideas. Now, in this next little part, he's going to talk about Ted Haggard and some plays. But what's interesting is that through this whole conversation, that they on one hand display the horror of, oh, these Christians are indoctrinating the youth. And this particular book that Dawkins is now, this is a book tour for Dawkins, okay? This is a standard book tour, not the Jordan Peterson faux book tour where he gives a new speech every night and with a veiled cover of a book tour. No, but this new book is for younger and younger audience. So as they keep talking about, well, we should leave those kids alone, but we're trying to get at these kids and indoctrinate them.
Yes, well, perhaps you're thinking of Bill O'Reilly. I'm not sure. Hell houses, where they
They talk about that.
Words that they said.
Yeah.
It was so preposterous that it actually, without being
deeply immoral thing to say, but I think he was sincere.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you. It's very disturbing. There's a great documentary on it as well for someone who wants to see like the thought process behind them creating this. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about the God delusion is that you kind of outlined every single possible argument against atheism and then how to counter to it in advance. Like if you have a soft position, look at chapter 1. If you look at this, look at chapter 2. And you outline that in the preface before you got into it.
Yes, well, I tried to be as persuasive as possible. The new book, Outgrowing God, is sort of aimed at a younger audience. And I like to think that it can be read at any age, but...
So indoctrinating children is good now?
Being aimed at a younger audience is a bit shorter and perhaps a bit easier to follow, I'm not sure.
And if you pay attention to this throughout the entire conversation, it just keeps coming up. Fascinating.
Why is it that you think that there are so many religions and that basically every single civilization throughout human history has had some sort of deity, some sort of higher power?
And now this is Joe Rogan, in a sense, for many people, made Jordan Peterson's career. And he asks this question, and I think, well, Joe Rogan didn't listen to the biblical lectures, because this is the answer that Peterson gives in the biblical lectures, and says that basically that we live deeply embedded. To be human is to be deeply embedded in this story verse. And we have these stories and we live within these stories. That the world is too complex. And the way that we manage this enormous complexity is to live within these stories. And then he says, well, we're not living within a story. And it's like, really? We're not living within a story. We're very much living within a story. It's just one narrative against the other, but we're living within the story of secularity. Well, we can't see it because it's the story that we live within, but we live within the stories. And so why would it be that everyone else in the world is living in a story except us? And you might ask, okay, you're going to look at evidence? Maybe you're living in a story too. Which, of course, when you get to movies like The Matrix and many movies today, this is the point of waking up and realizing I am living in a story. Well, I'm not living in a made-up story. I'm living in a story I have evidence for. I think every other society didn't believe they had evidence for their story, that they didn't have rules for figuring out what information should govern and what information wasn't. I mean, the naivete of this conversation to me is just amazing.
It's amazing the way they split and diverge and diverge and diverge. It's as though they somehow can't get along with each other. And
why wouldn't they? And why would their stories not get along with each other? Could it be that they're seeing the world in different ways, and it's actually within the conflict and the interchange within these stories that they're actually working out how to live together?
Maybe new leaders arise who have a leadership complex or something and want to found their own sect or type.
Oh, and so the stories are just things, propaganda by leaders. I mean, he makes this enormously postmodern argument here that all these stories are just so tales in order to oppress the people around him. I mean, and these two guys are sort of, pushing back against woke religion, but they just completely assume the entire premise of that argument.
Time and time again, you have breakaway religions, breakaway faiths. I don't know what the psychological reason for it is, but what I have
Maybe you should listen to the biblical lectures.
noticed is that they usually hate the religion which is the closest to their own more than they do more distant ones. And
That's right, because the religion is actually, again, the machine code by which the individual and the community is negotiating their place in a world that is far too complex to just boil it down into a group of facts. And so it's within the story, within the conceptualization, within the personification, and because that's how we deal with each other. Another person is a world of facts that is so complex. Personhood is the only way we can actually deal with the other person. And we so easily do it, we so effortlessly do it because of this machinery. Now we're just going to talk about all this machinery as being delusional, not realizing that we're using the machinery to try to denounce the machinery.
that has a certain biological ring to it too. That kind of makes sense to a biologist looking at.
Oh, now it's all biology again. Really? And so all of these stories, all of this stuff is just delusion. And this is where, now I'm not saying he's a Nazi because clearly he's not a Nazi. Now we're into the propositional labeling again. Is he a Christian? Is he not a Christian? Is he a Nazi? He's not a Nazi. But it's important to recognize the commonalities beneath this assertion of the biological. Now what I would say is that the biological is an aspect. My daughter I picked up my daughter for Thanksgiving break and drove her back home, and she was talking to me about this MTV show called Catfish, and talked about how, and as she was talking, I thought, boy, this is so germane to the conversations I'm having, where people sort of are being lied to online, and someone through their social media platform creates a certain image of themselves. And the whole point of this show is, in a sense, the revelation of the actual embodied person. Now, it's important to, again, note the dynamics here, where a human being is both and the what is matter for? Matter is for glory. Matter is for communication. Matter is to keep us on the same page. But it isn't, it isn't disconnected from story. I just, maybe I'll put the link into a Bernardo Kastrup piece that came across my Twitter feed today that, was talking about the end of materialism, because in his assertion, again, he's located in this whole conversation someplace, and a bunch of people have said, oh, you've got to read him. I haven't really read him much. I've read a few articles, but, the biological. So in other words, the talking we're doing right now and the tussling we're doing right now because American Christians are close to the new atheists, and we're going to be tussling over this. Of course it's a storied tussling. This is the only way we know how. And again, I very much recommend the Unbelievable podcast where Richard Dawkins is talking with a Christian and a Jew, and basically says, well, you're the nice Christians. I don't really care if you do the Bible and stuff. It's just over there in Texas and Oklahoma where they're trying to get it out of the books. In other words, it's just politics. But politics is the story verse.
Diverging species.
Well, it almost seems like if you were studying human beings, if you were something that was completely alien to our civilization, our culture, and you were looking at this strange tendency to believe in something that...
Now notice how he shapes the story. That, well, an alien coming down, he wouldn't have any of this. Really? How do you know? How do they manage the enormous complexity that, well, a creature that could, travel through space and all that would require? They would have to, they would very much have to figure out how to manage the enormous complexity of this universe. And what is the language? What is the machine code? How do they actually manage to do that? Oh, they would find our religion silly. Really? You're deeply embedded in the secular, which of course is the product of Christianity.
There's no proof of, and
There's no proof of?
a massive amount of energy into defending that, put it into your songs and put it into, your Pledge of Allegiance and all.
As if, again, this is something that we just put in, that we're all running around being pragmatic, and we just put this stuff in as an adornment, as an embroidery, not understanding that this is why we do what we do, and how we choose to walk through the cornfield, and how we choose to relate to another human being. He's looking at the coding and says, I see no code.
All these, which of course was not until the 1950s, but all the different things that people.
And why did it get put in the 1950s? That's pretty darn late to be putting in God We Trust on the money. There's a reason for it, because it's the reason that launched Peterson's maps of meaning, because in a sense he had so bought into the secular with his 12th grade deconstruction of God to say, well, why does the United States and the Soviet Union put the entire world at peril? Joe Rogan, who made Jordan Peterson in a way, is like, forgot everything you heard from him, didn't you? Just looked at the woke stuff and thought, well, that's bad. That doesn't seem crazy. Well, all the machinery you use to try and analyze those other human beings who are enormously complex, it's all story-verse machinery.
People have done in so many different cultures in regards to religion. It almost seems like a natural aspect of being a human being.
You're right that they.
It almost seems we have all this evidence. In fact, all the evidence says it, but we're not going to accept that because we're somehow above it. Really?
They put an enormous amount of energy and effort and expense and time and cost in share. I mean, some of the extreme sects which whip themselves with horrible weapons actually bleed.
Yes. And how would this? Why would they be doing this? Well, let's talk about the horrible sects of the blue and the gray that stood shoulder to shoulder and fired muskets fired mini balls into each other and took it. Why did they take it? They're running through they're working in the storyverse. Why is Richard Dawkins on the Joe Rogan show? Why did he write a book? It's people. It's the fish saying, "What is water?" And they're moving it around. They're swimming in it and say, "There's no such thing as water." These words that I'm using, they're not making stories. There's no metaphor. We're just talking facts. And it's like, you don't even, every time the facts are presented to you, you simply deny it.
Scar their own backs. It's very, very surprising to a biologist. We would think that they would be more interested in surviving and reproducing, but no, there's something about religion that makes them go to extremes of costliness.
If there's nothing worth dying for or suffering for, it's meaning. It's meaning. The fact that they're having this conversation at that table at this time after Jordan Peterson just basically says they haven't been paying attention.
And I don't get it, I must say.
I've thought about this so many times. Do you think that it is in some way a counter to the sort of existential angst that comes from being a finite life form? From being a thinking, conscious, finite life form that's aware of its own demise, it's aware it's coming. So it has to formulate some purpose and some meaning.
And a hope of an afterlife as well.
Yes, and that is the purpose and meaning, right?
Yes, I suppose that's right.
Now, pay attention here. Afterlife comes fairly late in the process. Even in the Old Testament, you have Sheol in this dark place, a Hades-like place of the soul. Somehow when they talk about religion, all religion to them is Christianity and all of the aspects. That's the only thing they know. And it's like, would you two read a little bit of history, please?
Yes, I think that's right. I can understand why people might want to believe a priest who comes along and tells them you don't have to worry about death because you're going to survive it.
And again, we have another little just so story where all of this religion is just priestcraft. And again, listen to Rene Girard and why did religion appear and What did it appear to try to do? Religion affords human community. You can listen to Adam Friended on this, who's borrowing from Jonathan Haidt. You can have a totally secular approach to this that these two seem to know nothing about. That religion, people want life after death, so they made up a story. Well, who made up a story? Did they make it up consciously? Did they make it to fool people? Did priests just make this story up in order to get money from people? Well, that's a nice, suspicious way of thinking, but it doesn't hold to the facts, and these people want to talk about facts. Well, this is a fact-free conversation.
I'm less understanding of people who make up stories to comfort either themselves or other people. I mean, a made-up story should not be comforting. I don't understand how a made-up story can be comforting.
Really? You don't understand why people are watching Netflix all the time and derive comfort from all of these made-up stories? Yes, there are made-up stories. Yes, the reason that we do suspect priestcraft at times is because, that does happen too. But to simply dismiss everything according to those lines, again, doesn't hold to the evidence.
Of course, if you make it up and persuade somebody else, then they could find it comforting.
But would you die for a story that you overtly, in a rationalist way, made it up to comfort yourself, to fool yourself? We're usually not that gullible of our own machinations.
On the other hand, is an afterlife really all that comforting? When you think about half of them believe they're going to go to hell, so it's anything but comforting. And also, even if you're not going to hell, if you're going to heaven.
And now this whole section about hell, if you're going to make up just so stories, then make up just so stories where your enemies go to hell and you and your tribe goes to heaven. And so again, I listen to these guys and it's like making up just so stories. Well, you should know something about that because you're not even paying attention to the data of religion.
Eternity in heaven, I mean, sitting in heaven for not just bit.
Have you ever listened to a lousy love story on the radio? You completely, I want to be with you forever. Do you not understand how language works?
Millions of years, but trillions of years. I mean, these are time spans beyond our comprehension. How unbelievably boring it would be.
Maybe to spend it with you.
Though, I mean, I don't know. I enjoyed life, but if I had to live my life over and over again, infinitely.
You just kind of laid out the premise of escaping the cycle of reincarnation.
If I had an infinite number of this
eternity is what's frightening about death, and eternity is best spent
nowhere and nothing. Isn't that it?
Under a general anesthetic.
Okay.
Which is what's going to happen.
Right. Gonzo. Out go the lights. Maybe.
Yeah.
Or maybe not. Have you had any experience with psychedelics?
All right. So, I don't know if I'll do a video on this whole thing, but again, they can't see their own religion, and they can't see what's operating underneath. The extreme naturalism that asserts that this biological substrate is the only thing that matters, a complete blindness to the understanding that it's within the storyverse that we actually manage the most complex other things that we're in community with. In fact, 7 billion of them, which are other human beings, and it makes up our capacity to engage with the world. Just watch History Channels alone and look at how religious they get out there in the wild. It's just simply how we navigate this world, and the secularism that they've all embodied. Well, in a sense, it's both the second class and the preparatory move by which you can begin to understand Christianity. It's Christianity light, as Glenn Scrivener made, and which brings us back to the definitions. of, okay, how do we define, how do we use this propositional way of knowing? What's its role? What's the role of the material verse? How do we hold this thing together? And how, in a sense, do we then come together and have collective cognition to figure this stuff out and live together and work together and actually arrive at even the morality that has so deeply impacted the atheists that they use it to condemn and critique the church or the Bible or Christianity. So I'm about out of time. I don't want to take too much time on this tonight, but I wanted to make a video for Monday, and I hope I got the sound right, and there'll be more.